Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. It's always hard to try to read the tea leaves on a piece of legislation before it's fully unveiled, so we're relying in some part on statements of the negotiators involved. But another one I want to highlight is from Senator Chuck Schumer. He says, I expect an omnibus will contain priorities both sides want to see passed into law, including more funding for Ukraine, unquote. And Kate, let me throw that back to you, because this has been a question where there have been some Republicans who have become more and more skeptical of Ukraine aid, and particularly in the House, as the House changes over to Republican majority, the question has been whether a Ukraine package could get through a Republican House. And so perhaps that's one of the pluses for Mitch McConnell or other Republicans who are looking favorably on this idea of an omnibus, is getting that done and taken care of. And so that Ukraine aid in 2023 is not in any doubt any longer.
Yeah, Kyle, I think that would be one plus side of doing it this way, though, to Kim's point, the cost could be really high and what they extract on domestic spending could be significant. And the failure of Republicans to get any discipline on the non-defense side is really significant. On Ukraine specifically, I do think you would want to see a consistent ability for the U.S. to provide aid and continue to authorize and appropriate money for that purpose. We've seen some floating news reports this week that the Biden administration is thinking about offering a Patriot missile battery to Ukraine, which would be really significant, Kyle, in helping Ukraine defense against these attacks on Kiev and other places, on infrastructure, on other non-military targets. It would be really a significant development for their defense in a long winter. This is just one reason that continued support for Ukraine from Congress is really important, and it would be good to get more of that authorized as part of this deal. Also, Kyle, keep in mind, when we're talking about Ukraine assistance, a lot of what we're talking about is refilling our weapon stocks for things we have already provided to them, such as javelins, stingers, and the like. So when Congress appropriates this money, significant chunks of it are going to our own military preparedness and making sure that our cupboards don't get too bare as we try to help friends in Europe.
The other side of this argument is coming from Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader in the House, maybe the next Speaker of the House, maybe not. Put a pin in that for now. And here's the argument he's making on Fox News last night.
Why wouldn't you wait 21 more days? What they're talking about is adding the baseline, meaning where would we start in the next year? They want to increase it somewhere between $90 and $130 billion. Instead of saving money, instead of cutting back in this world of inflation that we have, why wouldn't we, if we do nothing in a CR, we're going to save ourselves almost $100 billion. That's the hard-earned taxpayer money. And are you going to get a time to read it? They're trying to jam us right before Christmas. Why would you ever move forward when there's a change in power in 21 days where Republicans would have a stronger hand?
Kim, his argument there is that Republicans will have a better negotiating position in January when they take control of the House. I wonder what you make of that, and in particular, because the question of Republican unity or disunity in the House has loomed so large in recent days. It is still very unclear whether Kevin McCarthy is going to have the votes to become Speaker. And so I can understand how, from Mitch McConnell's perspective, the idea of kicking the spending, government funding argument into the early days of January when the Republicans may still be in a little bit of chaos in the House is maybe unappealing.
Well, that's his excuse. Yeah, and I guess it's a pretty convenient one. Look, I couldn't agree with McCarthy on this more. First of all, just to drill in on his point about enormous boosts in spending, the increase here in defense spending is going to be about 9%, which, by the way, is totally fine and not even enough. We need to be doing far more. But if you add in, therefore, parity, because again, I still believe that is what Democrats are going to get in the end on the domestic spending side, however it's hidden in this bill. I mean, 9% increase again on domestic discretionary spending. This is insanity in terms of the amount of money that we have spent over the past 2 years. And it's also true they are going to jam it through before Christmas. You know, even though they have supposedly a top line agreement, it's going to be 4 or 5 more days before the bill is actually written. It probably won't be unveiled until, you know, the wee hours before everyone is trying to run out of town. This is how omnibuses are always handled. It's really an atrocious vehicle and an atrocious end of the year thing to do to taxpayers. Now, essentially, Mitch McConnell is saying, well, we don't trust Kevin McCarthy to do this next year. Well, all right. Yes, there is certainly some worry that a fractured caucus over there could have some difficulty unifying around a defense bill. However, let's not forget that Mitch McConnell is a spender. He loves to spend money. He has no problem with this process. And, the other thing that's working for Republicans here that McConnell is ignoring is maybe it's time to have an old-fashioned spending fight, a real brawl where we are, in fact, talking about shutdowns in order to get priorities. What I don't understand is why Mitch McConnell hasn't said to Democrats, I am not moving on this point about decoupling. You shut down the government and you'll own it because you're in charge of the Senate, you're in charge of the House, and you're in charge of the White House. Next year, they'll have shared responsibility if there were a shutdown. This, to me, seems like a much cleaner thing to do. But he doesn't really want to have that fight. And look, by the way, he's got a bunch of retiring members like Richard Shelby who are headed off back to their home states, and they want to go out on a big hurrah of a whole bunch of earmarks. So this is the actual dynamic. I think it's a little bit phony to suggest that House Republicans don't have what it takes to get it done. I think that you'd certainly end up with a better product next year than you are going to get with this steaming pile of a mess.
Kate, do you agree with that assessment? I mean, maybe Leader McConnell, maybe we're overrating the chances of real chaos in the House next year. Maybe things will get settled. Maybe there will be some people who decide they're not going to vote on the speakership vote, and so Kevin McCarthy gets through and can manage his caucus in a reasonable way. Maybe I'm overestimating the likelihood of a Ukraine aid package really getting hung up in the House. Kate, do you agree with Kim here?
Well, yes, I'd love to associate myself with Kim's remarks about the atrociousness of this process. And I might have been a little optimistic earlier about the parity question. I do think it is possible that reports of Republican disarray are overstated. And I do have a slight bias, as I've described, against a full year continuing resolution, because we always end up back at the same stand, which is basically that continuing resolutions impose a very modest amount of discipline on non-defense spending. They don't deal with entitlements, which are on autopilot and make up the core of the United States' spending problems. What these continuing resolutions do accomplish is that they choke the Defense Department, keep it from starting new priorities. I mean, we're talking a lot about the threat from China. We need the new B-21 bomber. We need a lot of our procurement projects to arrive on time. I mean, a continuing resolution for a year really would be an unserious message in that environment. So I guess that biases me against a full year continuing resolution to some extent. But it's not a binary choice. I do think that there is a chance that McCarthy hangs together more closely than you mentioned, and that they could get a better omnibus deal than they are now. I think that's what we have to see over the next few days here. Kim noted Kay Granger's absence from the release touting this deal. There is a real question about whether it's good enough for Republicans. And so I do think if they drive that process into the new year, it doesn't necessarily have to end in a full year stopgap measure. Maybe they can drive a better deal than the current one that we have now. But I'm not sure. It's an open question at this point.
Kim, we'll give you the last word, but did I detect any fatalism in your previous comments? Does it look like, from where we stand now, that the appropriators are going to have the votes for an omnibus, or could it really depend on what sort of ugly gimmicks, as you mentioned at the top, are struck here? I mean, don't forget the very narrow majority in the House that we have. We have a 50-50 Senate. Is there still a chance that the omnibus comes out and people decide that they don't want to vote yes on it?
Well, here's my worry, and I guess that was why I was sounding so aggressive, is that the fundamental dynamic here is that McConnell is negotiating from the weakest of hands. And what do I mean by that? To get this over the hill in the Senate, you need 60 votes, okay? So fundamentally, any bill that is more generous to Democrats is going to get all of their votes. Okay. And in the meantime, all McConnell has to do is get 10 big spenders who are willing to go along with giving Democrats everything they want. He's not going to have any trouble with that. And similarly, the dynamic in the House is that Nancy Pelosi is now down to a 2-vote margin. So she needs a bill that, again, is very generous to all of Democratic priorities to hold her caucus together and get it over the line. That all but guarantees that this bill is going to have exactly everything Democrats wanted in terms of parity and domestic discretionary spending. And so I think that as long as McConnell and Richard Shelby, the top appropriator for Republicans, are willing to give Democrats all of that. And even if they have to hide it in all kinds of different ways, dumping it in the supplemental, making some of it mandatory, they'll do it because they want this deal themselves. And the price of it is what Democrats are demanding.
Thank you, Kim and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.